Good morning, class. Welcome to another chapter of our Read Aloud, The Call of the Wild. So yesterday we finished chapter 9 and we learned about Buck's new owners, and they are not great. They don't know what they're doing, but they don't want to learn to know what they're doing, so they're just doing a really bad job right now. So let's see what adventures they get up to today in chapter 10. This chapter is called Hitting the Bottom. Of course, they ran short on dog food. Charles and Hal overfed the dogs at first. The 6 outsider dogs had big appetites. Mercedes, with tears in her pretty eyes, could not get Charles to give the dogs more, so she stole from the fish sacks and fed them secretly. But it was not food that Buck and the Huskies needed most, it was rest. And though they were making poor time, the heavy load they dragged took all their strength away. Then the underfeeding began. Hal realized one day that his dog food was half gone and they had covered very little distance. They could not get more dog food, so he cut down on even the usual amount and tried to increase the day's travel. It was easy to give the dogs less food, but it was impossible to make the dogs travel faster. The men didn't know how to work dogs. They didn't even know how to work themselves. The first to go was Dub. Poor thief that he was, always getting caught and punished, he had still been a faithful worker. The outsider dogs did not last long. One by one, they died. By this time, there was no joy in this Arctic adventure for any of the 3 people. Mercedes no longer wept over the dogs, she only wept over herself, except when she was quarreling with her husband and brother. And the 3 did quarrel. They were stiff and in pain. Their muscles ached, their bones ached, and their very hearts ached. They had only hard words for each other. In the meantime, the fire remained unbuilt, the camp half-pitched, and the dogs unfed. They thought only of their own misery and gave no thought to the animals. Through it all, Buck staggered along at the head of the starved team as if in a nightmare. He pulled when he could. When he could no longer pull, he fell down and remained down till blows from whip or club drove him to his feet again. His once beautiful fur was dull and matted. He had become so thin that each rib and every bone in his body showed through his loose hide. It was heartbreaking, yet Buck's heart was unbreakable. The man in the red sweater had proved that many months before. Buck's team of 6 dogs looked like skeletons. They no longer felt the pain of the whip, and their eyes looked lifeless. When the team stopped, they dropped down in the traces like dead dogs, with no spark left. When the club or whip fell upon them, the spark somehow fluttered, and they tottered to their feet and staggered on. There came a day when Billy, the good-natured, fell and could not rise. Buck and the others knew their own time would be soon. On the next day, Kuna went, and only 5 of them remained. Joe was too ill to be mean. Pike was crippled and limping. So Lex, the one-eyed, was still faithful to his work even in his agony. Teek, who had not traveled so far that winter, had been beaten more than the others, and Buck was still at the head of the team, but he was too weak to lead the starved, weary dogs. The dogs were falling. Mercedes was weeping and riding. Hal and Charles were arguing. This was what they were doing when they staggered into John Thornton's camp at the mouth of the White River. When they stopped, the dogs dropped down as though they all had been struck dead. Mercedes dried her eyes and looked at John Thornton. Charles sat down on a log to rest. Hal did the talking. John Thornton was whittling an axe handle. He whittled and listened, gave short replies, and very little advice. He knew this type of traveler, and he knew they would not listen to advice. John Thornton did tell them not to take chances on the ice. Hal waved his hand towards the frozen White River. "They told us up in Skagway that we wouldn't make White River, and here we are," said Hal with a jeer. "They said we should stay away from travel over ice, but we made it." "And they told you true," John Thornton answered. "The ice is likely to bottom out at any moment. Only fools could have made it. I tell you straight, I wouldn't risk my life on that ice for all the gold in Alaska." "That's because you're not a fool, I suppose," said Hal. "All the same, we'll go on to Dawson." He took out his whip. "Get up there, Buck! Hi! Get up there! Mush on!" Thornton went on whittling. He knew these fools would not listen. But the team did not get up at the command, and so the whip flashed out. John Thornton watched in silence. So Lex was the first to crawl to his feet. Teek followed. Joe came next, yelping with pain. Pike made painful efforts. Twice he fell over, then went half up, and on the 3rd attempt managed to rise. Buck made no effort. He lay quietly where he had fallen. The lash bit into him again and again. He did not whine or struggle. Several times Thornton started to speak, but changed his mind. Tears came to his eyes as the whipping went on. This was the first time Buck had failed, and this angered Hal. No matter how hard he beat Buck, the poor dog would not budge. All day Buck had felt the thin, rotten ice under his feet. He sensed that danger lay ahead. He refused to stir. He felt numb. He no longer felt pain. He was slipping away. And then, suddenly, John Thornton sprang upon Hal. Mercedes screamed. Charles looked on in confusion. John Thornton stood over Buck, enraged. "If you strike that dog again, I'll kill you," he said at last. "It's my dog," replied Hal. "Get out of my way or I'll fix you. I'm going to Dawson." Thornton stood between him and Buck and would not get out of the way. Hal drew his long hunting knife, but Thornton rapped Hal's knuckles with his axe handle, knocking the knife to the ground. Then he picked up the knife himself and with 2 strokes cut Buck's traces. Hal gave up on Buck. What use was he anymore anyway? A few minutes later, the tender feet pulled from the bank and out onto the frozen river. Buck heard them go and raised his head to see. Pike was leading, so Lex was at the wheel, and between were Joe and Teek. They were limping and staggering. Mercedes was riding the loaded sled. Hal guided at the gee pole, and Charles stumbled along at the back. As Buck watched them, Thornton knelt beside him and petted him with rough but kind hands. Dog and man both watched the sled crawling along over the ice. Suddenly, they saw its back end drop down and the gee pole jerk into the air. Mercedes screamed. They saw Charles turn 1 step to run back. Then a whole section of ice gave way and the dogs and humans disappeared. A white hole in the ice was all that was to be seen. The bottom had dropped out of the trail. John Thornton and Buck looked at each other. "You poor devil," said John Thornton, and Buck licked his hand. So not a happy ending for most of the sled dogs, but Buck has been saved. And that is today's chapter.